Obviously, the end of the Cold War, which officially came to an end in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and which included also the collapse of all those communist satellite countries in Eastern Europe. That Cold War coming to an end obviously had profound effects worldwide on all kinds of things, politics foremost among them. However, it also led to some major developments in the 1990s where trade was concerned, and those developments in trade are going to also have an effect on environmental concerns. So, for one thing, with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the world was no longer divided into two teams that were in competition with one another. And now, with the most of those, although of course, Cuba and China, North Korea remained as communist countries, but with all those communist governments in the Soviet bloc falling, that opened up the opportunity for corporate capitalism to extend across national boundaries into the former Soviet Union, Russia, the Russian Federation, and the various other countries such as Ukraine that came out of that, as well as former Soviet bloc countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. It also facilitated trade with countries that were not in the Soviet bloc that perhaps had positive dealings with the Soviet bloc. So essentially, capitalism really scored a big victory, not just in the field of public relations, but in economics as businesses started expanding into these areas where they had previously not been able to get, and barriers were breaking down between countries, trade barriers. There was talk of, well, there was lowering of tariffs in some cases, the abolition of some tariffs, and free trade became really the big catchword of the 1990s. Now, way back in 1946, 47, I think it officially went into effect in 48, there was an agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that was comprised of 23 countries that essentially were on the winning side of World War II. And they set up opportunities for free trade among themselves, right? These are the countries in the Western Bloc that had freer trade than they had in previous decades. But in 1995, the mid-90s, with this change that had come about with the end of the Cold War and borders opening up everywhere, that GATT or GATT was absorbed into a new organization created in 1995, the World Trade Organization. And on a more local level, the year before that, in the Western Hemisphere, you saw the signing of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which guaranteed free trade between or among the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And at the time, politicians from both major parties in the U.S. were predicting that this would lead to a lot of really great entrepreneurial advances, except for Ross Perot, who was not a member of either party but was an independent candidate for president back in 1992 when this was being discussed. He famously said, "You're going to hear a giant sucking sound, and that's the noise of all of the American jobs going to Mexico when this thing opens." And as it turned out, there was quite a bit of that. So everything is open as of the 90s. Well, almost everything, certainly compared to how it was before. What does that mean for the world in general? Well, let's see what free trade and expanded capitalism did for the wealth of the world. Of course, most of the countries had that we're looking at here as of the year 2000 had a head start right before 2000, or before 1990, I mean. But just to take a look at this representation of the globe, if each country had its size corresponding with the size of its gross domestic product, and you will see that North America has the biggest chunk, and that's mostly the United States. Canada is up there like a little hat on top of the U.S. Western Europe is pretty big also. Japan and South Korea. Take a look though at the countries of China as well as India. You'll see that they're kind of smushed up. They're not doing as well as the countries in red, and of course, bordering China, you have the former Soviet Union, which is also spread pretty thin. But notice the size, looking at it, gauging it by wealth, of Africa, I think the largest continent geographically. But take a look at it here. It's hardly anything at all. It is atrophied. In fact, look at the whole southern hemisphere, with the exception of Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, those red blobs over there to the right. Overall, that whole southern hemisphere not looking really healthy. Now, of course, this map is from more than 20 years ago now. So let's look at something a little more recent. Here we go. This one is from 2017. And it's not done the same way as the others. Instead, it shows what percentage of the pie, the global gross domestic product pie, each country has. And this isn't every country in the world. If a country has less than 0.3%, which apparently quite a few do, they don't even make it on the pie. So you can see the United States has about a quarter of the whole pie. You can also see that between 2000 and 2017, over in Asia, there were some changes. Now China has gotten significantly bigger than Japan. China and India have increased, whereas Japan and South Korea have decreased in their percentage of the overall pie. But take a look at the African countries. Only 3 African countries made it into the pie. So that's 3 African countries out of 54. So 51 did not have a gross domestic product big enough to even be charted here. The 3 that did make up just a tiny, tiny little sliver of that pie. And then if you go over and look at Latin America, you'll see that Brazil is doing pretty well. It's pretty big. Mexico kind of maybe so-so. But the other countries that make it, which are 5, are pretty small when you put them all together. They also comprise just a very small part of the pie. So therefore, although some things have changed in Asia, particularly in East Asia, things haven't changed that much in Central and South America and in Africa in roughly the last 20 years. Perhaps this whole situation reminds you of our discussion earlier in the course about world system theory and about the shift, the transition from mercantilism to capitalism in the sense of eventually industrial capitalism, but basically the beginning of the modern world with the beginnings of world or global capitalism in the 15th century with the age of discovery. And remember, we talked about external systems. For example, we talked about subsistence cultures and systems. and the fact that both of those would be absorbed by the global capitalist system as they encountered them. And then remember, we also talked about in that discussion of world system theory, first world countries, second world, and third world countries. First world countries being high technology, high profit countries, with the second world being kind of in between, intermediate technology, simpler manufacturing. But the third world countries basically supplying the raw materials for everybody else. And those raw materials are stripped from the third world countries, with them getting very little, if anything, in return. And you will recall when we talked about hegemony and the fact that first Great Britain and then later the United States gained global hegemony, that in order to maintain that hegemony, a country that has it has to become sort of like a global policeman. Remember that. And the biggest threat to hegemony is the nationalism of smaller countries, because if they look after their own interests rather than the interests of the hegemonic power, then that puts a kink in the hose. So if those third world countries in particular have too much democracy, they become a threat to the first world countries, because they can put that kink in the hose and minimize the profit that the first world countries take out. And what that means, how that translates into the 21st century, is that corporations primarily found based in the northern hemisphere use the labor and the resources of the countries in the southern hemisphere and give them very little in return. So you can see how that works just with these images. So that's where the business part comes in, the finance, the economics. But what about the environment? Well, think about this. If resources are being stripped from third world countries, how much attention is being paid to being environmentally friendly? How much attention is being paid to being sustainable in that type of system? And how much power do corporations, who tend to be somewhat short-sighted when it comes to sustainability, how much attention, with all the power they have, how much attention are they paying to the environment? Will they pay attention to the environment just based on their own sort of ability to recognize long-range benefits and forego short-term profits? Or does there have to be some kind of external force that sort of regulates and forces them to do that? Because leaving it up to their own initiative, how well does that work? On the other hand, here's an example of how, to an extent, up to a point, sometimes globalism has led to some advances in environmentalism, because with those open trade barriers, those open borders, the World Trade Organization being formed, that is comprised of 90% of the, well, not 90% of the countries, but 90% of the money in the world. That kind of cooperation starts to become a little more possible, beginning the year after the official collapse of the Cold War, beginning in 1992 with the very first Earth Summit in Rio. It was a United Nations summit, which has been held regularly, I think annually since, maybe it's biannually. But political leaders from around the world and representatives from activist groups came together this first year and continue to come together to try to achieve environmental protections. And that very first one in 92 led to efforts toward climate change action and protection of the lands of indigenous people. And that latter thing, the protection of indigenous people's lands, goes hand in hand with protecting the environment. Maybe you have become a lot more aware of that over the course of this class than you had been before. But with all that we've talked about, I think that you can probably see how those things continue to go hand in hand. Now, in 2002 in Johannesburg at the Earth Summit on Sustainable Development, that one was boycotted by President George W. Bush. And this is where things can become problematic with this type of international cooperation. The countries who carry the largest responsibility for producing pollutants and the countries who also have maybe the most ability to do something about it, particularly the United States, are not consistent because due to the fact, and we're going to discuss how this happened in a little bit, due to the fact that protecting the environment went from being kind of an apolitical thing that both major parties were invested in the 1970s, started to change in the 1980s, and by the 21st century was very much a political thing that was divided by party in the United States, so that when the Republicans are in power, whether it be having a majority in Congress and or having the White House, they are less likely to cooperate to benefit the environment at the expense of regulation and corporations and other businesses making less money. And then, Democrats come in. Oftentimes, it kind of some of that lost ground is regained, but not always. So that's one example of that happening. And another example of this phenomenon of politics influencing United States involvement in international agreements comes up with various international agreements to try to limit chlorofluorocarbons and thereby reduce climate change, which we will discuss in a few minutes, the science of that. The first such protocol was in 1987. 24 countries came together, including the United States, in Montreal, and set out some regulations to reduce CFCs, carbon emissions, and did reduce them worldwide. However, by the mid-90s, because in part so many developing countries were increasing their carbon emissions significantly, the levels rose back to the previous levels. Now, why were developing countries all of a sudden producing so many more carbon emissions in the first half of the 1990s? Well, it ties into what we were just talking about, the opening up of global trade and the tendency of that to have first world countries extracting resources from third world countries, and those second and third world countries doing increased manufacturing. All right, so there's clearly need by the mid-90s for a revision of that protocol. So there was a meeting in Japan, in Kyoto, 1997, in which the people who agreed, the signatories, the nations that signed on to this, agreed to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and again we'll explain what that is in a few minutes, in developing countries, and by doing so to return things by the year 2012 back to where they had been in 1990, right? So trying to regain some of that lost ground. This protocol was signed and ratified by 191 countries out of 195 countries total that exist. However, However, they were not. Okay, so Clinton was president at this time. 1998, Bill Clinton signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. But for it to go into effect, for it to be official that the U.S. was part of this, it also had to be ratified. It had to be ratified by Congress. All right, the 1998 midterm elections led to Congress having a 55-45 split with Republicans in the majority, the Senate, the Senate 55-45, and it did not get ratified by the Senate. Then the next election came along. George W. Bush was elected into office, and he withdrew the signature even from the Kyoto Protocol. So the United States was not involved in this protocol for the first period, which the first period in which these changes, these regulations were to be put into effect was 2000 to 2008. Now, the second period was to be 2008 to 2012. By then, Bush was still in office. 2009, Obama came in and did sign on, but still, it was not ratified by Congress. It never was by the United States. Third wave was 2012 to 2020. Never did get ratified. Here is a map of the countries who participated or did not participate in the Kyoto Protocol. The two countries that did not sign on, never signed on, and obviously were not ratified, were they're in gray here. Western Sahara, they're in northwestern Africa, and the other one, Afghanistan. The countries in red signed on to the protocol, but the United States signed on but never ratified it and didn't participate in it. Canada signed on and ratified it but withdrew from it eventually. So they were on board for a little while, then they withdrew. So overall, over a 20-year period, by the year 2009, at the end of that first section of the protocol that lasted through 2008, at that time, looking at the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over a 20-year period, Europe had actually decreased their CO2 levels by 4.9%. However, the U.S., which did not participate in the protocol, and Canada, which only participated for a short time, they actually increased the amount of CO2 by 20.4%. Finally, a major step forward was made in 2015 in Paris with the Paris Climate Accords, or the Paris Agreement, at the international meeting, COP21, Committee of Parties, which were nations that came together under the aegis of the United Nations to every year still goes on. In this case, this thing that was signed in December 2015 was adopted by 195 countries. As I mentioned earlier, there are 195 countries. So everybody agreed to this. Everybody adopted this and signed on to what was the first ever universal, legally binding global climate deal. So the long-term goal was to keep the increase in global average temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius above what it had been in pre-industrial levels, and to limit the increase to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that is the basis. There is what the global temperature was before the Industrial Revolution started. The global temperature is on its way to potentially getting to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above that level, which causes significant problems. So, goal is keep it below 2, and if possible, keep it to 1.5. Also, an agreement for global emissions to peak as soon as possible. That is going to require countries agreeing to move toward non-carbon emitting propellants, electricity, whatever it takes, and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in the amount of global emissions that are produced. So, peak as soon as possible. In other words, like as soon as possible, let's get a handle on this and make sure that wherever it is at that point is the highest it ever gets, and then work on trying to get it back down in accordance with the best available science. So everybody signed on to this until shortly after Donald Trump was inaugurated president, whereupon he withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, saying that it was a scam and it was a way to try to hurt the United States. So the U.S. did not participate during the Trump administration. As soon as Biden got inaugurated, within a month afterward, the United States was re-entered back into the Paris Agreement. But during those 4 years, it wasn't just a matter of we're not reducing carbon emissions. During those 4 years of the Trump administration, regulations were pared way, way back, and so emissions significantly increased during that time. All right. Well, we've talked a lot about the politics of trying to limit carbon emissions and to limit global warming, climate change. Now let's talk about the phenomenon itself.